So the Puerto Rico IFE, International Financial Entity, becoming very popular, mostly because Puerto Rico has positioned itself as a quasi offshore jurisdiction, but still obviously has significant connections with the U.S. And for all intents and purposes is the U.S. absent formal recognition as a state and the IRS and its banking division, right? They have their own. But court systems, everything else is basically part and parcel of the United States. But the IFE is growing in interest, and I had written sort of a missive about the process and procedure, but for you nonverbal types, I wanted to follow up with a brief overview here on what it's all about, right? And I get a lot of questions from my crypto community in terms of, is this an available avenue, right? Can we do something with it? But we'll start at like the basics, right? So the IFE is exactly what it says it is. It's a international bank license, right? And you're holding the IFE prohibits you from actually dealing with Puerto Rico residents. You can only cater to outside individuals. IFE is one of the more least expensive international banks that you can acquire. So typically when you're talking about offshore banking and starting when you're looking at Dominica, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, Vanuatu, Comoros on the very far end of the world, and some other places. But Puerto Rico requires capital in the amount, working capital in the amount of $300,000, and then paid in capital in the amount of $250,000, which can be shown in different ways depending on how you capitalize the company. Like IP, for instance, can count against that $250,000 mark. And the process is, relatively straightforward. You apply and present something that's called a permit to organize, which includes proposed corporate paperwork, your business plan, the formal application. It's sort of a check the box machination of what you have to do for the final application, but it allows you, once it's granted, to organize as the banking company, right? Because obviously, just like you can in the States, you can't just simply go create a company and use the word bank or trust or similar words, right? So that process begins, the permit to organize. Once that's through, then you go through the actual application, which is an iterative process, right? You file an application, you receive comments back from the regulators asking you to clarify or expound upon certain elements of the application of your business plan and stuff like that. And what I found in my experience in doing them is that the hardest, most difficult element is really the business plan. Because the business plan, and this is a relatively recent change to the process, is that the business plan must be in conformance with New York Federal Reserve guidelines for business plans. So it's fairly expansive and it's fairly technical, right? It's not just a simple let's slap this together. It's a serious thing, and you have to be right on point. And if you're missing a section, they'll let you know, and your application will continue to not go through. And you only have 6 months from the date that your permit to organize is granted to complete your application, or your application will be denied. So the clock is ticking, right? So you must do that. So, all in all, under normal circumstances, and if you have your ducks in a row, you could probably get one of these done in about 4 months. And, it's obviously subject to being able to show the requisite amount of capital and the requisite amount of paid-in capital. But still at $550,000, it's significantly less than in Dominica or St. Lucia, where have you, for various reasons. But the advantage obviously is, again, it's that offshore advantage. Now, tax rates, there is a tax rate of approximately 3 to 4% versus 0 in the other jurisdictions that I've mentioned. But nevertheless, there is a degree of security that comes with it, right? There's some more redundancy in Puerto Rico's government than you find elsewhere. There's some more stability, believe it or not, in Puerto Rico than there is elsewhere. And it's easier to deal with. Now, you are subject to like US KYC and AML, Patriot Act obligations. So it's not a free-for-all. It's not particularly great for high-risk banking. Um, but it does, enable you to operate in a fairly well-respected jurisdiction and pay very minimal tax, right? It's not zero, but 3-4 is still a lot better than 38%. So, you have that, and it's very attractive, as I found, to many people who want to bank, quote unquote, offshore, and it's also not deemed offshore. So for purposes of like FBAR and reporting and all that, then I would say talk to your tax advisor in that regard. But it's definitely something that if you're looking for a low cost, fully operational banking structure, it's a great place to at least start, right? To at least start. You can always bootstrap that into a more respected jurisdiction when you get sufficient assets under management and grow the business. But it's a great place to at least start, right? And I get the question a lot of times, can you connect with the Federal Reserve in the United States? You could at some point. Approximately 2 years ago, there were some banks that were effectively laundering money, and the Federal Reserve has since, without specifically saying so, has failed to allow for Puerto Rico IFEs to open accounts at the Federal Reserve. So that may be changing as time goes on, but for right now, you're still looking at correspondent banking, which is the trick with any offshore bank, is finding that correspondent banking. Obviously, there's plenty of banks that do it because there's plenty of offshore banks, and we know many of these offshore banks. But you do have to acknowledge the fact that you are effectively working through another bank, right? You have a bank charter, you can offer the full range of banking services, but you are going to have a correspondent relationship to actually function, right? So definitely interesting. Now in the crypto space, Puerto Rico is kind of agnostic, right? I wouldn't say it's perfect, right? The bank charter is very specific, and the bank statute rather is very specific in terms of what you can and can't do. It doesn't mention crypto, but it mentions custody of metals and other assets and custody of commodities, which again, crypto is a commodity. And it also acts as a payments license, right? So if you think of the regime in the continental United States, with money transmitter licenses being the sort of standard bred and mechanism for creating a crypto exchange or a peer-to-peer platform, the same could be held true in Puerto Rico, right? And this bank license covers that, and the bank license also covers securities trading, right? So it's also sort of a quasi-brokerage license, if you could. So, all in all, very good place to start, right? I would say this, in terms of offshore jurisdictions right now, it's probably one of the more favored places to go until you graduate to that sort of second tier, which is like a EU-based, Cyprus, Malta, Gibraltar, locations more like that, or in the Caribbean, BVI, Caymans, stuff like that, where it's far more expensive, far more complicated, need a track record, and you can go from there. But as far as dipping your toe in the water and having a fully functional bank and not having issues with correspondent banking, the Puerto Rico IFE is a fantastic place to start, and we've run through that process a few times for clients, and would be happy to answer any questions that anybody has. So definitely feel free to hit me up, Adam at AdamTracy, TRACY.io, and I will talk to you later.